Hello, my name is Mae Culumber. I work for the University of California Cooperative Extension, and today I'm going to talk about walnut orchard irrigation and salinity management during drought. This is an outline for my presentation and how we will discuss how to manage irrigation during drought. First, we will cover the concept of evapotranspiration as a way to determine water needs during crop development. We will talk about methods to understand the crop threshold for moisture stress. We will cover the root zone soil water storage, irrigation system application rate, how to determine the distribution uniformity of your irrigation system, and then an overview of salinity monitoring and management in walnut orchards. So first, estimate of crop evapotranspiration and why this is an important number to understand between the last irrigation or rainfall event. Evapotranspiration is the sum of evaporation and plant transpiration and the movement of water from land surfaces and plant canopies to the atmosphere. A lot of research has gone into understanding and providing general estimates of evapotranspiration in walnut orchards from young to mature trees. This table shows for different ages of walnuts what you would expect in terms of the percent shading, which indicates the root zone coverage relative to the planting area and the irrigation system wetting footprint. And then the minimum daily evapotranspiration and maximum daily evapotranspiration that would be expected for a tree of that age. And then the corresponding seasonal ET, the cumulative seasonal ET. And so what you can see by looking at the chart is that a young first leaf tree is going to use less than a third as much water as what we see in a mature orchard. And so this is an important thing to consider. And you may even need to modify your irrigation system to target the root zone in those younger trees to help reduce the wasteful application of water. Irrigation management in walnut impacts all phases of nut and canopy development. The graph here shows the cumulative crop evapotranspiration throughout the growing season, which in the US starts from March and goes through November, corresponding to the growing season in Chile from June through February. From leaf out to mid-June, canopy development occurs, but this represents only about 25% of the total seasonal water use. 75% of water use occurs as that shoot growth slows and the tree focuses its resources on internal walnut shell and kernel development and floral and vegetative bud development for next season. The increase in water use continues all the way until close to the end of the season when walnut kernels mature, hulls split, and it's time for harvest. Delayed irrigation in the spring can save water for the more intense water needs of the summer, but we recommend using caution with withholding water during this time because water deprivation in early season can reduce nut size at harvest. So it's going to be important to pay attention to the amount of soil moisture in the soil and the walnut plant water status if you are familiar with taking those measurements. So now we will talk about understanding the threshold for moisture stress in walnuts. A lot of research has gone into understanding the relationship between moisture stress in the tree and irrigation management and the resulting effects on growth and yield in walnut trees. Okay, so irrigating according to ET, as I mentioned earlier, and soil moisture monitoring, which we will cover in later slides, doesn't provide information about how orchard trees respond to the applied water schedule. The pressure chamber is a useful tool to monitor trees' response to deficit irrigation at different stages of growth and make sure that the trees are not suffering detrimental levels of stress. So this is a particularly useful tool to use to monitor tree response to deficit irrigation in years with drought conditions. The University of California has several publications describing the proper use of a pressure chamber for walnuts and a variety of other crops. A pressure chamber is an instrument that can be used in the field to measure the pulling force required in a plant to extract water from the soil and pull it through its leaves. The readings are referred to as what's called water potential. So as a tree transpires, water moves from the soil where the water is at a higher potential through the xylem and the vascular system of the tree, up through the scaffolds into the atmosphere. The water movement is under a high level of tension, which varies depending on the level of moisture and that rate of transpiration. There are several techniques to evaluate water status in plants, but today we will focus on measurements corresponding to midday stem water potential. Midday stem water potential values for a fully irrigated walnut tree, what we sometimes refer to as the baseline level of stress, is going to vary depending on the relative humidity of the air and the air temperature. So as air temperature increases and relative humidity decreases, that baseline will change and become more negative. But the general range for a well-irrigated tree is usually thought to be between about -4 to -6 bars. The range of tension for walnut is between -2 to up to -18 bars. In general, values between a -2 to -4 are values you would see in the early season or soon after irrigation, and these values indicate the trees have adequate moisture and may even be too wet. When we see readings between -4 to -8 bars, this indicates low to moderate levels of stress. But this level of mild stress generally will not impact kernel development or bud fruitfulness for next season. And this is generally considered a good target area where trees are not over or under irrigated. Readings more negative than 8 bars indicate high stress, and shoot growth, nut sizing, and kernel fill will likely be impacted if you are seeing this level of stress on a regular basis. There have been many trials conducted in walnut in different regions of California using stem water potential as a guideline for irrigation management. There was a regional study in Chandler walnut to understand the influence of in-season deficit on different stages of growth and development and the productivity of those walnut trees. Irrigation cutbacks were imposed during the bud development and kernel fill stages in 2 6-year-old Chandler orchards in Northern California and Tehama County, and then more in the central part of California in San Joaquin County. And so the chart here shows the average seasonal stem water potential range for the different treatments in both locations, which reflect a 0 to 15% reduction in applied water, a 30 to 50%, and then 50 to 60% reduction in irrigation application. And this would be the corresponding average applied irrigation water for those different treatments. So, so shoot growth was observed in both locations, and there was a relationship between the average monthly growth of prune shoots and unstressed conditions. So when you have low levels of stress, remember I said -2 to -4 bars, we're going to have no reduction in shoot growth. Maybe with mild and moderate stress, we might see a slight reduction in prune shoot growth, and then a significant reduction when we get closer to that -8 bar range. And so this data is just for the Tehama County location, where we see the trees were mechanically hedged walnuts, Chandler walnuts on paradox rootstock. The other location that I mentioned, data is not shown here, did not have the same response and did not where the water stress did not appear to impact shoot growth. And some of the reasons behind this may be that this location in the San Joaquin Valley had deep alluvial soils that likely retained more soil moisture. For both locations, there are some more parameters that were looked at, including the change in buds that opened, the change in the number of floral buds, and the change in the flowers per floral bud, and then the overall change in nut load in response to the different deficit irrigation practice levels. And at the Tehama County site, which I already indicated had a more severe response in terms of shoot growth, there was a large reduction in the change in nut load in response to the irrigation reduction. So this a 24% reduction in nut load and 31% reflects an irrigation reduction, but in the range between 30 to 60%. There was also a response in the San Joaquin site, but not to the same extent as what we saw in the Tehama County site with the mechanically hedged trees. Okay, and then in terms of field weight yields, there were 3 years of yield observed, both in the Tehama and San Joaquin County sites for the different levels of stress to the trees. And at the Tehama County site, there was no difference in the first year of deficit reduction, but by year 2, we were starting to see a significant reduction in yield in response to the deficit irrigation. In 2004, there was a 26% and 42% for the 2 different irrigation reductions. We also saw a decline in the San Joaquin County site, but it took 3 years of deficit irrigation for there to be a significant difference in the field level yield. And that 2004 yield reduction was around 20% for those deficit irrigation trials. So in conclusion, we find that yield tends to decline between 20 to 40% during drought. But in the circumstances for both of these locations, they return to full production in the same season that normal irrigation was resumed. A bit more information in terms of yield, the nut quality. We saw an edible yield decreased with increased water stress in 2 of 4 years of the study. So 2 years there was no change in nut quality, but 2 of the years there were decreases, and so this corresponded to some darkening in the kernels. And then in terms of the tree health and longevity of trees subjected to deficit irrigation in those trials, 1.3% observed a mild to moderate decline in the tree health and longevity, and the same percentage, 1.3%, there was 1.3% mortality in trees that were maintained in a greater than -14 bar range. Deficit irrigation has more adverse impacts on young tree growth and development than mature trees that, at least in this study that I've highlighted, return to full production in the same year that normal irrigation was resumed. So just some concluding statements on the response to deficit irrigation. This method is not as effective in walnuts compared to other tree crops. So walnuts seem to be very sensitive to deficit. Yield and nut quality, drought impacts varied by location, depending on the different management practice. So I highlighted here the difference between hedging and non-pruning, and there could also be potential differences in soil moisture holding capacity in response to that deficit. The study observed a 20% reduction during mid-season kernel development, nut maturity, harvest, and post-harvest stages, but this may be effective to conserve up to about 203 millimeters of applied water. You can minimize tree growth and nut production impacts by using water stress measurements to maintain trees in that -5 to -9 bar range. The time required to return to full production after water storage has passed could be less than 1 season. Withholding water during late season growth stages will save the most water with the least negative impact on tree health and productivity. As little as 25 millimeters of applied water post-harvest can conserve water and minimize the chance for autumn frost damage. Okay, so now we will talk about root zone soil water storage. So when we talk about soil moisture storage, we need to think about how the soil responds at different levels of moisture in the soil. So the illustration here shows that when we have saturated conditions, there's this probably too much water and no irrigation is required. And then when we have field capacity conditions, which is the amount of moisture in the soil after an irrigation or rainfall event, after all of the excess water is lost to runoff or percolation below the root zone. This is considered what we call field capacity, and it's the upper range of the amount of available water that the soil can hold between field capacity and what we refer to as permanent wilting point. However, there is a desired range of available water that represents the moisture that's in the soil that can be extracted without imparting a significant level of stress on the tree crop. And so this desired range between field capacity and management allowable depletion is where we want to keep our the moisture status of the soil during the irrigation system. During drought, it may be necessary to maintain that soil moisture level just above what we call management allowable depletion. So in walnuts, that management allowable depletion is about 50% of the total available water. As mentioned earlier, available water is mainly determined by soil texture. This is because soil particles of different size characterize different soil textures. Sand has the largest particle size, but it has the lowest level of surface area. It has a lower level of surface area compared to silt and clay. Small particles have more surface area relative to the volume of soil. When you have more surface area, you have more water retention. And so this is why coarse textured sandy soils have a lower water holding potential, and those that are on what we call the heavier side have a higher water holding potential. And when you have a lower water holding potential, you have a higher permeability of moisture through the soil. So coarse textured soils have greater permeability than a clay textured soil. Other factors can affect your water holding capacity include the level of salt in the soil. If there are restrictive layers in the subsoil of your location, rock content can reduce water holding potential. Soil organic matter levels will influence this and generally increase the holding potential, and there can be spatial variability at a field level. So the soil storage and available water, as I mentioned, will vary with different textures of soil. And this table provides the general values that correspond. We have those reported in both inches per inch of soil, inches for foot of soil, and then millimeters of water per meter of soil. So for an example, if we are looking at a soil with a fine sandy loam, there is about 142 millimeters of water per meter of soil. For a 1.5 rooting depth of a walnut tree, that is equal to 213 millimeters of available water. But as I mentioned in the previous slides, not all of this water is easily available for uptake by the walnut tree. So as the soil dries, some of that water is too difficult for the tree to extract. And so that level of moisture between field capacity and management allowable depletion is about 50%. So that would be half of 213 would be about 106.5 millimeters of water. There are a few ways to assess that range of soil moisture in the field. Something important, whether you use more sophisticated means of technology, it's good for everyone to be able to go out to the field to understand how the soil feels can tell you a lot about how much moisture there is. So the charts here show different levels of moisture from wetter to drier for different textures of soil, from sand to clay. And so when you're using this method, you need to try to form a ball in the palm of your hand. And we're looking for a couple things. We're looking for how well that ball holds together and how much of an outline on the rest of our hand the soil sticks to our hand. So when in wetter conditions, we can form a ball for almost all different soil textures, and we will see a lot of sticking residue on our hands. As the soil dries, in a sand soil, it's going to be difficult to even form a ball, and it will easily crumble. And then with less residue left on your hand because there's less moisture. In heavier clay soils, we'll be able to form a ball, but it won't flatten with pressure, and it seems to break apart easy. And again, we won't have a lot of that residual soil left on our hand. Our hand stays clean. And so these are just good indicators that you can calibrate for yourself to say, okay, this is what the soil is like after irrigation, and this is what it is like for maybe say 4 days after irrigation. And so it's a good guideline to say, is it time to irrigate or should I wait? There are different soil moisture sensors available. This example here are sensors that use soil tension is reported in centibars. So if you're more familiar with readings in terms of bars, 0.3 bars is equivalent to about minus 30 centibars. And so in the table here, we have different levels of soil tension that are going to vary with different levels of different textures of soil. And so here, when we have a depletion of plant available water greater than 40%, it shows you what the corresponding soil tension would be. And so in a sandy loam soil, when you reach 30 centibars, this may trigger a need for irrigation, whereas in a clay or clay loam soil, you may reach as far as a negative 177 centibars before there is a need for irrigation. So these tools can help you determine when to irrigate, but they don't tell you how much you need to apply. Some other tools use capacitance monitoring. So these soil moisture sensors, instead of tension, actually provide a volumetric estimate of soil moisture at depth increments. So it can be more easily used for actually scheduling the amount of water to be applied. Monitoring soil moisture at depth increments. So in the previous example, there may have been fewer depth increments. Here you have many depth increments, and so you can watch throughout the season as each layer in the soil, going from the most shallow to the deepest, is depleted of moisture. The roots begin to extract water from deeper in the root zone. So in this graph, the roots are most active in the surface layers to begin with. And then the deeper roots only become active as they're needed, as the soil moisture depletes from the surface deeper into the soil. And so this can be a useful tool actually for seeing for a given irrigation set, the duration of the irrigation set, how deep in the soil moisture, in the soil profile, the moisture responds to that irrigation set. Irrigation system application rate. It's easy to over-irrigate or lose water to the deep percolation if your system application rate and soil texture is not taken into consideration. Your scheduling calculation should consider the percentage of the wetting area impacted by the system and soil type. Soil type influences the subbing of water in the shallow layer of the soil. So in the example here, clay, you would see more subbing at the surface. So the water is going to move outward from the irrigation emitter. And in a sandier soil, we're going to see, water is, you may remember I said that the sandier texture soil does not have as much water holding capacity. And so water is going to move more quickly and percolate deeper into the soil in a sandy soil. And so this is going to impact what percentage area is covered by the irrigation system at the surface. We can take into consideration what our output is. So if we know that our irrigation system has an output of 1.13 millimeters per hour, if we consider that percentage of wetting area affected by the soil texture, for a sandy a loam texture soil, maybe we will have a 30% wetting area relative to the whole planting area for that type of emitter. So this is going to equate to an output rate of 3.8 millimeters per hour. So a higher application rate than the specifications of the system. So here's an example where we take that into consideration. So if we know that the daily water use of mature walnut orchard during summer is 8 millimeters per day, or 56 millimeters per week, and trees extract moisture from 30% of the wetted orchard area, our water use will be the 8 millimeters per day divided by 30%. It's actually going to be a 26.7 millimeter per day rate. If our soil moisture storage for a fine sandy loam to 1.5 meters is 106.5 millimeters, 106.5 millimeters divided by the daily water use tells us that there's only going to be 4 days to that management allowed depletion level of moisture. If our irrigation system has an application rate of 3.9 millimeters per hour, this is the equivalent of a 27-hour irrigation set, nearly every 4 days. And so this would be a recommendation that might fit with the heat of the summer when your evapotranspiration rates are at a maximum. So you would need to apply irrigation for 27 hours, but that irrigation set duration is going to vary dependent on your soil infiltration rate and your water holding capacity. So you need to make adjustments accordingly. Okay, so your irrigation system distribution uniformity takes into consideration applying water at the right rate and frequency to conserve water, but to maintain the water at the appropriate level to avoid severe stress. So although irrigation systems are highly efficient, these small micro emitter openings are highly susceptible to clogging and leaks, which will influence your output and distribution uniformity. So your systems require routine inspection and maintenance to function properly. We recommend annual water quality analysis to assess potential clogging hazards to these systems. So as I just mentioned, although these systems are highly efficient, almost all of them will have a varying level of what's called distribution uniformity across the block. And so a professional system evaluation is recommended every 2 to 3 years. And so in the illustration here, you have 2 fields with 2 different distribution uniformities. And if the field is analyzed in 4 quarters, the way that this is calculated is looking at the difference between the lowest quarter output compared to the highest quarter output. So this is the range of different outputs in millimeters for this system at 90% DU. A 70% DU is going to have a wider range in output. So this is the lowest quarter of the field, putting out 17.8 millimeters per set compared to 36.1 millimeters at the high range of the set. So the DU can both mean a lower output, but it can also mean that you're greatly going over your intended irrigation application rate. So from the previous slide, this table compares the different DUs and the millimeters of water applied in the highest and lowest quarter of the field. So here is the millimeters of water applied in the highest, the lowest, and then this is the difference across one irrigation. So at 90% DU, you may only have a difference of about 5 millimeters in a single irrigation set, but cumulatively across all of the irrigation sets in a season, this can add up to a significant difference in water application. So this could have large implications for saturating the root zone and creating saturated conditions that are bad for the health and longevity of the tree, subjecting it to infection from disease and other sources of abiotic stress. Okay, so finally, we'll talk about salinity monitoring and management. Salt-affected soils or saline sodic soils can result from poor water quality. It can result from the misapplication or over-application of fertilizers and compost. Regulated deficit irrigation, this can be a side effect of that. If we have low levels of rainfall to accomplish leaching, and we need soil and water analyses are necessary to evaluate whether or not we are dealing with salt-affected soil. Salinity tolerance in walnuts. Walnuts are susceptible to salt damage. And a general rule of thumb is that for every 1 decisiemens per meter increase in soil salinity over 1.5 decisiemens per meter, you may expect a 20% reduction in growth and production potential. And so these are some of the thresholds that we see for the most critical of salts: sodium, chloride, and boron. Research by retired UC Cooperative Extension Advisor Janet Caprill found that California grown walnuts, English walnut rootstocks had the most foliar injury, the highest concentration of those three toxic ions, boron, chloride, and sodium, in the leaf tissue. Trees on black walnut rootstock were the least symptomatic and had the lowest accumulation of toxic ions. Trees on the hybrid paradox rootstock had intermediate symptoms and tissue levels. And so those conclusions correspond to the levels shown here for those three toxic ions. And you can see significantly higher levels of those in the English walnut rootstock compared to the paradox and black walnut in most circumstances. So with irrigation, water, and soil evaluation, what our goals are to assess the potential for osmotic stress and ion toxicity potential. So osmotic stress refers to the tree working harder to take up and transpire because the increased salt concentration in the soil. So as salt concentrations increase around the roots, there is less solute differential between the root sap and the soil water. This reduces the ability of the root to pull in water by osmosis. Electrical conductivity is a measure of the total dissolved salts present in irrigation water or soil water and provides an indication of potential for salt stress on tree growth. So you may remember a few slides back, I mentioned that for every 1 increment, decisiemens per meter above 1.5, we start to see a decline in the growth and yield potential for walnut. So as salts accumulate and as that salt pressure outside the root continues to increase, it becomes too much for the roots to exclude those toxic salts, and then they begin to accumulate in the woody tissue and leaves. And then eventually we'll see those necrotic burns on the margin of leaves, and this characteristic is known as specific ion toxicity. So the necrotic leaves that I showed on the previous slide here. Another thing that we are looking to assess with looking at the different parameters of soil and water is to understand if the conditions are such that they will induce induced infiltration problems. And so saline sodic and sodic soils can have varying levels of overall soluble salt, but in either situation, they have high levels of sodium. In these type of circumstances, soil reclamation amendments will likely be required to treat this problem. And then always following amendment application is needed to conduct reclamation leaching. And so these values are also very important to calculate your reclamation leaching calculations. If we are trying to conduct in-season maintenance leaching, the leaching fraction is calculated based on the percentage of applied irrigation water. So we're going to apply a percentage of water above what that crop evapotranspiration is and soil moisture depletion. The goal is to prevent the buildup of salts during the growing season by percolating water and salts below the root zone. But careful management is necessary to prevent the oversaturation of soils. And when there is a water shortage, it's probably better to perform this leaching in the winter when evapotranspiration rates are low and as a means to conserve more water. And so here in this graph, for example, if you have an average root zone soil salinity of around 3 and your irrigation water has a value of 1.5 decisiemens per meter, you're going to need to apply a 10% maintenance leaching for this in-season water application. Sodicity influences infiltration problems in the soil. And so in this graphic, I'm comparing soils with two different types of conditions. And so a general rule of thumb when you're looking at this value, this is SAR, this is a sodium absorption ratio value. If this value is greater than 5 times the amount of the EC of your water, we tend to see soil crusting and infiltration problems. When the SAR is less than 5 times the EC of the water, we see little to no infiltration problem. And the reason for this is that when sodium is a dominant ion in the soil, it has a tendency to cause swelling between the platelets because of its large sphere of hydration on these molecules. So they have a large sphere of hydration. They tend to push the particles apart and disperse the soil structure of the soil. And this is particularly a problem at the surface of the water, at the surface of the soil. When we have a more balanced composition of ions in the soil, where we have a lot of calcium and magnesium in addition to the sodium, the calcium has a double charge, which more strongly holds soil particles together. I did not mention that the sodium only has a single charge. So it is not only does it have that larger sphere of hydration, but it does not adhere to the soil surfaces as strongly as calcium. And so when you have a balance of calcium in the soil, you will not need reclamation amendments to drain salts from the soil. The soil remains well flocculated and permeable from the surface through the root zone. So when we determine that we need to apply soil amendments, the purpose of doing this is to supply more calcium to displace sodium and leach it from the root zone. Okay, so that amendment selection, it's a very complicated process to determine, but some general rule of thumb is that when you look at the level of calcium and carbonates in the water and free lime in the soil, this can help you determine if you need sulfur products that are acid forming, or if you need calcium products. So we tend to need sulfur products when we have conditions with a high level of lime and high pH. We tend to need calcium products when the levels of lime in the soil are low, and we tend to see low levels of carbonates. So again, if your bicarbonates in your water are high, or the level of lime in the soil is high, we will tend to need acid forming amendments. When those levels are low, in less than 2.5% bicarbonates or less than 1% lime in the soil, that's when we tend to need calcium amendments such as gypsum. Okay, so choosing the best amendment requires balancing the cost against how quickly reclamation must take place. Once again, the estimated rates for acid amendments assumes that there is already sufficient lime to react with the sulfuric acid in the soil. And so these are some different types of amendments that are available: gypsum, sulfuric acid, sulfur. And then the table shows when we use milliequivalents per liter of calcium as a measurement, this is the corresponding rate per acre foot of water. I'm sorry, I did not do the conversion for this example, but basically what we are trying to do is if we have the EC of, if the EC of the water is calculated based on the composition of sodium, calcium, and magnesium in the soil, we're going to try to raise the total EC by increasing the calcium. And so this in effect will lower the SAR. So we're increasing this value. We're increasing the value of calcium so as to lower the proportion of sodium that increases the sodium absorption ratio. So we're trying to raise EC and lower the SAR value. Low to moderate application rates would be considered to be raising that calcium value by about 3 or less milliequivalents liter of calcium. A moderate to higher rate would be 4 and above. Calculating soil applied rates. This is so much information for one discussion, but you would need to determine that calcium requirement. You need to determine the milliequivalents of calcium per 100 grams of soil that are needed to displace sodium. You would need to know, in order to calculate the amendment rates from your soil analysis, you need to know your SAR, your exchangeable sodium, the exchangeable sodium percentage, and your CEC. This agricultural salinity and drainage management is a great resource, and there are some example calculations within this book. If there are larger amounts are needed to reclaim soil, if you have a salinity problem that is not limited to the surface of the soil, but throughout the entire root zone, you may need to consider applying soil applied rates in addition to amendments applied through the water. But again, the goal is the same. We're trying to reduce that exchangeable sodium throughout the entire root zone. So these are some example rates. Still, you're trying to increase the milliequivalents of calcium per 100 grams of soil within the calculation. And so these are some of the standard rates you might see. This is shown to designate caution with the use of sulfuric acid. We don't recommend that you apply more than 1 to 1.5 tons of material per acre foot of soil, as a high level of acid can be detrimental to the trees. It can actually burn the tree roots. After amending the soil or water, your root zone needs to be flushed to remove the sodium. Otherwise, the remaining salts will precipitate as the soil dries, and you will not be successful in reclaiming the soil. So earlier I mentioned an in-season leaching percentage fraction. This would be based on a winter leaching program. And so in the table here, we have the depth of water in millimeters that are needed to lower the EC by 1.5 decisiemens per meter. So if your average root zone decisiemens per meter is between 2 to 6 decisiemens, this would be the depth of water in millimeters that you would need to apply during that winter period to make a change. Just a general rule of thumb for salinity management from early to late winter. First, you will want to fill your profile to fill capacity. So if the soils are dry, you want to make sure they're at fill capacity. So between 75 to 150 millimeters applied over a period of 3 to 4 days, and then allow a couple days for drainage. And then you can begin your leaching applications. And so throughout the season, you're going to need throughout that winter season, you're going to need probably between 150 to 250 millimeters. But this could vary depending on your soil texture, the EC level of your root zone, the final salinity goal, and the EC of your reclamation water. I always like to make a mention of cover crops. Not all growing climates are conducive. In California, we see this, some areas this works very well, better than others where we don't have as reliable rainfall, but cover crops are important. They're shown to improve infiltration. They prevent the soil surface from droplets under sprinkler irrigation and from rain. They reduce the formation of soil crusts, and they reduce erosion and runoff. And so it's a good best management practice to include in your orchard operation if possible for you. In summary, on irrigation management during drought, if soil moisture is adequate, delayed irrigation in spring can save water for more intense need later in the summer. A 20% reduction applied water during mid-season kernel development, nut maturity, harvest, and post-harvest could conserve up to 203 millimeters of applied water. A deficit beyond 20% will likely reduce yield, but time required to return to full production after water shortage could be as early as one season, but could be several seasons, depending on your orchard. Midday stem water potential quantifies how an orchard is responding to soil, water, and climatic conditions. It can confirm assumptions made by the water budget and moisture depletion approaches. It's recommended to maintain your trees in the -5 to -9 bar range. Soil moisture monitoring can lead to improved irrigation decisions on frequency and duration. Consider site-specific information about soil texture when scheduling irrigation, and conduct regular maintenance on irrigation systems to ensure good distribution uniformity. And then with salt management, salt problems can develop in walnut orchards in semi-arid climates regardless of water quality. Salinity creates osmotic stress and ion toxicity potential and can induce some nutrient deficiencies and contribute to infiltration problems. Soil and water analyses are necessary to choose the correct type and rate of amendments and the leaching fractions. Amendments are applied to reduce sodium and calcium. To replace sodium with calcium to improve soil structure and infiltration. Leaching must follow amendment application and best accomplished in the dormant season when the ET rates are very low. Cover crops will protect the soil surface and improve infiltration. And that concludes my talk. Thank you.